Women.
Things are changing. Good day, sir.
It didn't go too well for McClung.
Take it from me, Mrs. McClung. Nice women.
Become the first in Canada to get the provincial vote. And now the fight is over, at least in the Western world. My next guest says feminism is done. Galvin McInnes is a writer with StreetCarnage.com, joins us from New York. Now, Galvin, you've written this latest article. It's called Catfight. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about it. This isn't the first time you've written about feminism. Let me start by asking you, because you upset a lot of feminists in this world, why do you hate women so much?
I hate women because they're not attracted to me anymore now that I'm ugly. So I search the internet for statistics to justify some sort of attack on them because it makes me feel better about myself.
Okay, so you say feminism is dead. You've gone on in this article to say feminism can't complain about real suffering anymore, so they create straw men to rail against. What do you mean there?
Yeah.
What kind of straw men are these women creating?
Well, for example, I was defending Terry Richardson because he's a photographer who slept with this woman who was like a porn star, pinup girl, whatever. And several years later, she decided she didn't enjoy the intercourse and criticized him. I defended him saying, sorry, that's not rape. You're trivializing rape. And then I was called a rape apologist. So they take a statement like, I find women can be annoying when they're drunk. And then they change that into women should not be allowed in bars.
Right.
And you go, I never said that.
Well, you know, I don't identify with the feminist movement so much because I think there's such a negative stigma attached to that word. But let me play the devil's advocate for a second. You know, women will come at you and they'll say, we still get catcalled in the street. There are still some statistics that show that women make less than men. This is a movement that is ultimately about empowering women. You know, how do you respond to that?
I say, I'm not counting Islam or anything east of Europe. I'm saying today in the Western world, 2014, the crusade is done. Women don't earn less than men. Women choose to earn less than men when they're married and have kids because they'd rather go to their daughter's piano recital than stay up all night working on a proposal. When women are single and young, they actually make more than men. And as far as catcalling goes, working class women, black and Hispanic women, enjoy catcalling. Middle-class liberals hate it, but I'll tell you, the only thing women hate more than catcalling, even white middle-class liberals, is the day it ceases.
I hate catcalling, but I still get catcalled. Now, I want to pull up a few...
Come on, you really hate it? Hey, beautiful woman, I find you attractive. How is that annoying?
Well,
hey, woman who spent some time getting ready this morning to look pretty. You did it. It worked.
Okay, fine. But let me pull up a few boards from men actually, that have responded to your article because, you know, the first thing that came to my mind is none of them are wearing a wedding ring. So this one says, I'm a happy feminist because feminism empowers me. The second one says, I'm a happy feminist because not all men are jerks like Galvin McInnes. I guess that's you. The third one says, I'm a happy feminist because I get to be an aspiring ally and work with amazing people. And the fourth says, I'm a happy feminist because I can wear what I want. You know, again, I got to go back to this point. None of them are wearing wedding rings. Let me know if you think that matters. And the second point is I think they missed the point.
Well, that's how bad it's gotten. Now feminism has become so loose and so diluted that men are coming aboard saying, hey, I can be a feminist because it's okay to be gay. And you go, what are you doing here? You don't belong in this movement. Or I heard a girl the other day saying, I need feminism because we still live in a culture where it's considered okay to cut off the top of a baby's penis.
Right.
And you go, that's a penis. You don't have one of those. You can't be. Why are men coming aboard? And I find when I say things like I recently said it's okay to hit a woman if she hits you 12 times. And I had all these male conservatives saying that's disgusting. You should never hit a woman under any circumstances. And feminists were saying 12, more like 1. We're equal to men. So I find that modern feminism is worse for women than traditional conservatism. And even there's a new anti-feminist woman named Karen Strawn.
I've met her.
She's like a 5 out of 10. Yeah, she's not that hot. But she was saying that before feminism began, they were considering, the president of the United States was considering making wife battery a capital offense. So traditionally, men have been more, delicate, or have considered women more sacred than feminists have. They're all about slut walks and have sex till you're 40 and work your ass off supporting a family. They're harder on women than women.
I want to ask you.
I mean, than men. Sorry.
We have just a few moments left, but I want to ask you because I think that the pro-choice movement has become synonymous with the feminist movement, and there are so many men in this world today that are, over the top pro-choice. What do you think? Is it because they personally are pro-choice, or is it because of their own self-interest?
Free love is very convenient for single guys. Slut marches are very convenient for single guys. There's a lot for men in feminism. It's a great place to be because it means you get to have sex with whoever you want, and when she gets pregnant, she aborts it. About 50% of women are pro-life. And what's really interesting about abortion is we're getting towards gender-based abortions, as we've seen in China. That doesn't go well for women. Women are having abortions based on gender.
They're happening in Canada,
tend to
too.
lose on that.
They're happening in Canada, too.
So it's starting to become a genocide of unborn females. So you have free sex, genocide of females, and oppression of pro-life women. Abortion has nothing to do with feminism.
You've sufficiently made me blush this interview, but that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining me.
You're an 8. Thank you for having me.
I want to bring in to join us a special guest, Jillian Gilchrist, who is a feminist advocate from Connecticut. She champions public policy on issues of gender, gender-based violence, and reproductive choice. She's an organizer with the Women's March in Connecticut, and she currently teaches political advocacy at the Yukon School of Social Work. Jillian Gilchrist is also she also wrote a column for her site in which she talked specifically about the idea that Judge Gorsuch would be terrible for women, and the reason that he would be terrible for women is because he's a proponent of originalism. Professor Gilchrist, are you actually a professor, or is it just Miss Gilchrist? I want to address you properly.
Hi, it's Ms. Gilchrist.
Okay, Ms. Gilchrist, thanks. Thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. So what you actually wrote is you wrote that Gorsuch, like Antonin Scalia, is a proponent of originalism, which means he believes a judge should attempt to interpret the words of the Constitution as they were understood at the time they were written. When the Constitution was written, women couldn't own property. In 1787, women didn't have the right to vote. It would be 133 years before women won that fight, a fight they fought for 72 years. Considering women had no rights when the Constitution was written and there was no mention of women in the Constitution, originalism is sexist. So let me ask you first to expand on that. Is it the Constitution that's sexist or originalism that's sexist, or both?
Well, actually, the original Constitution is sexist, and then the originalist perspective that actually looks to the original document is also sexist. And so we know that when a judge practices originalism, they look backwards. They don't try to see the Constitution in the current context of society. And so by looking backwards, as I said in my piece, at the time the Constitution was written, women didn't have any rights. We were property. So, yes, the originalist perspective is sexist. And so I think Neil Gorsuch will not be good for women on the Supreme Court.
Two quick things. One, you're right, obviously. The women did not have rights under the Constitution in many ways. The idea that they were property is an overstatement. They couldn't be sold into slavery. I mean, black people were property. Women were not property under the Constitution of the United States. But I do have a basic question here, which is, what do you think a judge's job is? Right? I mean, a judge, from where I sit, and according to the structure of the Constitution, his job is to interpret the law as it's written, not to make up what he wishes the law were. That's what we have legislatures for. That's why we have people who vote on things. The idea that you're going to have some sort of super legislature made up of the great wise men or women who decide what a text means that has nothing to do with the original meaning of the Constitution. What do you think a judge's job should be?
Well, so what an originalist actually does, though, is goes even beyond that interpretation to an originalist thinks that the 14th Amendment, which would actually give women equal protection, based on what we know from Justice Scalia, he didn't actually think that that protected women. And so he thinks that equal protection does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. An originalist like Scalia also feels that the right to privacy is not included in the Constitution. And so I understand what a judge's job is, but then we also have, thankfully, the legislature. And so the legislature can pass public policies that will give women rights.
And to be fair, that's what Scalia says. I mean, that's what Robert Bork Rourke says. That's what Justice Thomas says. I'm an originalist. This is what originalists say. We say this is why we have legislatures. The purpose of a legislature is to pass things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You don't have judges who just sit there and then pass legislation. This is why we have separate branches. So again, I ask you, you're upset at the outcome of some of what the judges say because the judges are reading the text according to what texts mean. I mean, it's not poetry. But what do you think a judge should do that is distinct from what a legislature does?
Well, to answer that, I mean, what now is happening is so the legislature passes a policy to give women greater access. Let's use Hobby Lobby, since that's a case that Neil Gorsuch, ruled on. The Congress passed healthcare reform to allow women to have greater access to birth control. And when that then went through the court process, because conservatives argued against that, when it went through the court process, it was ruled down. And so, we might have the legislature, yes, we have judges, but with an originalist perspective, like Neil Gorsuch's and like Scalia's, when we try to progress women through public policy, it then is still being shot down in the courts because that originalist perspective, as I mentioned, is a sexist perspective. Okay,
so again, the problem is that, take Hobby Lobby as an example. It wasn't that Neil Gorsuch is against contraception, presumably. His church apparently is pro-contraception. The idea that Neil Gorsuch has a personal view that's anti-contraception, that's not accurate. Neil Gorsuch's view is that there's a First Amendment to the Constitution which protects the freedom of religion of people like the religious owners of Hobby Lobby, and said that they don't have to violate their own religion in the provision of health care. Now, you may disagree with that policy. That's why we have an amendment process. So the Constitution does basically enshrine certain fundamental rights. If we disagree with those fundamental rights, there's an amendment process. Or do you think that we should just get rid of the Constitution completely? Because it seems to me that's sort of what you want. We shouldn't have judges. We shouldn't have judicial review. We shouldn't have a Constitution. We should just have a legislature that does all the things that you want them to do, or judges that just say the legislature can do all those things.
No, not at all. We need to pass public policies, or we could amend the Constitution. And
right.
Women did try that through the Equal Rights Amendment, but that too didn't make it through.
Right.
And so, to your point about Hobby Lobby, it is the first decision where two competing interests, the religious freedom, religious rights of individuals, did actually then trump the rights of those who need access to birth control. And so I think a different judge in that position who doesn't have an originalist perspective like Neil Gorsuch's wouldn't have ruled in that way.
How should a judge read a text? Should a judge just decide what the judge wants to be the law and then just say this is the law? What standard do you use?
So my standard is that with the Constitution, I think it was supposed to be a document, a guiding document. And so I don't think anyone at the time the Constitution was written thought that the world would always exist as it was. And so I certainly think we need that text, but we should interpret it in light of what is happening in present day. We've changed a lot as a culture and as a society. And so to assume that you can use a text from hundreds of years ago to decide cases today just seems ridiculous. Except
that we do that with texts literally every day in the courts. We use the Sherman Antitrust Act to rule on antitrust. We use the Food and Drug Administration Act to determine what the FDA is allowed to regulate. Legislation is designed to be interpreted as text. This is just basic legal 101. You're supposed to read a text as it's written, not as a piece of T.S. Eliot.
Yes, but we use that text to interpret current day problems. And it seems that when it comes to women's rights, originalist perspective tends to side on the air of always looking backward and not looking at current day. Because if I wrote a piece of legislation 10 years ago and I said to you, okay, you and I write a piece of legislation today, right? And we use the language of today. We mean something by that language. In this conversation, somebody will read this 100 years from now, and we will have meant what we're saying to each other. We understand what we're saying. If somebody wants to read what we're talking about today, and then it turns out that all the words that we're using now mean the reverse because things have changed, did our conversation mean the reverse of what it meant, or does it mean what we're talking about right now? Words have meaning at the time they are said, and to try and read new meanings into old words just because, quote-unquote, times have changed, you can end up with some really bizarre results. And the problem here is that, you may not like what Neil Gorsuch is trying to do, but at least it's a rule of interpretation. In the constitutional structure, what we've had is the Supreme Court very often reversing itself on the exact same language by using the sort of rules that you want. So, for example, in Plessy versus Ferguson, you had the Supreme Court say that the 14th Amendment did not apply to black people.